Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today we're talking about Demi Lovato, recently identified as non-binary, and I've got a professor, philosopher of gender, who's written on gender. He's published on this, and I invited him to just share some of his comments on the podcast that they recorded. It was Demi Lovato, who is a famous singer, if you don't know who she is, but she came out on her podcast. She invited a friend of hers on, and they talked about gender, binary issues, and the reason why I wanted to do this, I mean, this came out, her podcast came out today. So this is a very quick reaction to some of the things that she said. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this was because I recently actually kind of got an interest myself in gender, basically based on the talk that I heard from somebody recently. And it just got me really thinking. I feel like there's so much confusion in this area. And I feel like it'd be helpful to have a philosophy professor, come on and help us sort through some of these issues. The point of this today is not to make fun of anyone, or if you were coming to see fireworks, someone give some conservative position against her views. That is not the purpose of this podcast. The podcast, at least my purpose, is kind of self-interested. I want to learn more about the sorts of distinctions that are made here. What does non-binary mean? And maybe you'll find it helpful as well. And then also along the way, she and her co-host, or the guest that she invited on, they did make some claims that I think are deserving of at least some pushback and some thoughts, at least from Dr. Bogardus. So anyways, thank you, Thomas, for coming on. It's going to be a really cool episode. We'll try to stick to about an hour, a little bit less probably dialogue between the two of us. Maybe later on, we'll get to some Q&A with the audience. We'll see how that develops. But let's get some overall thoughts from you, Thomas, on just what your thoughts were when you watched her podcast episode.
Thanks very much for that intro. I think you're certainly on the same page. So I got my PhD in philosophy, and I wrote a dissertation on philosophy of mind. And then I sort of worked in epistemology for a few years. And then, like you, it started coming to my attention. I mean, these conversations about gender started bubbling up into the popular culture. And I, like you, I was very curious about what these categories mean and what people are saying and why they're saying it. And so I think around 2015 or 2016, I started reading a lot of this literature. There's philosophers working in this area, in the philosophy of gender. And really, it was just out of curiosity at first. I had no intention of writing on it. But then after a few years of reading about it, I thought I might have something to say about this. And so since then, I've published a couple papers on these issues. And if your viewers are interested, they can just Google my name and find my website and read those papers. And I think there's one that I've finished and that I'm working on getting published now. And maybe I have one more in me, and I don't know if I have anything after that to say about gender. But all that to say, I've been thinking about it for a few years, and I've published on it a bit. Also appreciate. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say to kind of bring it back around to Demi, this video, and by the way, I've got it linked in the description of this video if you're interested in watching it. I think it's about 30 minutes long, and it's a good. One of the things that I really liked about it was there was a real strong emphasis on like loving people, and I don't want to use the word like. There was a lot of hurt. There was a lot of hurt that they were both describing as like, this is if you come out as sort of non-binary, or if you want to use these different pronouns, there's a sort of risk in doing that. You can be the subject of abuse and mockery. And so, but it seemed to me like what they were trying to do is to really get to like who they are as people. And it just struck me as like, there's a lot of virtues and a lot of good things that I think that they're trying to get to and try to attain. So I want to emphasize that, and I want to say that that's all of that stuff is awesome, and that's good. And those are very good things to focus on, and I see it as a kind of motivation for like why people are kind of going down this road. So I just wanted to acknowledge that at the forefront. But one of the things that got me kind of interested and wanted to do this today, I'll let you comment on what I just said, but the fact that like, so I logged on Twitter this morning, and that was like the number one headline off in the top corner was like, Demi Lovato comes out as non-binary and then changes her pronouns to they, them. And I was like, why? Why does that make the news? Why is this something that like everybody has to know about, everybody's talking about? It's just it's kind of an interesting phenomenon to me that is what is dominating headlines as of today. So, do you have any thoughts on either of those two things that I said there?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, something I wanted to say was I really appreciate what you've said so far regarding like what you heard when you were listening to the podcast. And that's something I do want to talk about, this sort of theme that one hears in the podcast when Demi Lovato and her guest, Alok, I think is how you pronounce the name, Alok.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly hear a history of pain and struggle, and a desire to live an authentic life. So that's one thing I definitely want to
Yeah.
talk about. But really, really quick, first, I wanted to say that I think it's important that, especially as Christians, one remembers that when we're talking about issues like this that bear on sort of the Christian view of the world, I always think it's good to remember what Peter tells us in 1 Peter 3:15, that we should do this with gentleness and respect. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And then I also, just in preparation for this conversation with you, I've dug up this nice quote from Plato that I like, from Book 7 of the Republic, where Plato's reflecting on people who are new to philosophy. And he says, youngsters, as you may have observed, when they first get the taste of philosophy in their mouths, they argue for amusement, and they're always contradicting and refuting others in imitation of those who have refuted them. Like puppy dogs, they rejoice in pulling and tearing at all who come near them. And so maybe you've met people like that who sort of view philosophy purely as like instrumental, and the purpose of the instrument is to refute people or like make them realize that they're wrong or mistaken or silly or something like that. Maybe it's just a combination of having children of my own or being middle-aged, but I've come around to the view that that's not what philosophy is for. And really, philosophy is a very useful tool for understanding people, and coming to grips with what they're saying and seeing their view from the inside. And so I hope that's what we can do today. And to just get started with that, maybe we could return to that theme I mentioned that one hears in this podcast with Demi Lovato and her guest, Alok. You hear this theme of authenticity. I have some questions here, but I don't know. Let me share some quotations really quick.
Yeah. So what you've done, and I'll just give people a kind of to set your expectations. So Dr. Bogardus has actually kind of outlined everything that they've talked about. Not everything, but a lot of what they've talked about. He's got quotes and stuff. So what we're going to do, we don't have any clips set up because this was all thrown together so quickly. We've got some, he may read some quotes that he's got from the video, and then he'll provide some of his comments as a philosophy professor on gender, who's written on gender. And the reason why I'm doing this, again, I have a personal interest. I'm sure that a lot of you watching, there's 173 people watching right now. I'm sure that a lot of you have a kind of similar interest. Is like, I want to learn, personally, I just want to learn more about this, and I want to learn some of the different terms that are being used here, and how people are sort of coming to these different positions. And it's not really like, this has nothing to do with Demi as a person. This has nothing to do with Alok as a person. This is more for me about understanding the ideas, understanding the concepts, why people are sort of drawn to these different views. And as someone who tries to think analytically, that's the goal for me, is to really just better understand what's happening here, sort of moves that are being made. And hopefully as we're going along today, it's going to help you as well. So so where would you like to begin?
Yeah. So I'll try to keep reading to a minimum, but I guess this is just sort of a product of my training. Like
you can even just sort of summarize what the sort of point that they're getting at. And then also mention the timestamp. That might be a way of being charitable as well. So like if they want to hear the original comments, they can go do that.
Yeah. So I've had it drilled into me that it's important, like when you're discussing somebody's ideas, to not misquote them or misattribute things to them. So that's why I was going to share some quotations. But let me just do a bird's eye view really quick. There's just two things I want to talk about in our short time. One was, I'm sure a lot of people are curious about this category, this category of non-binary and what it means. What is Demi Lovato saying with this identification as non-binary? So that's one thing that I think we should discuss. But then also something I found interesting in this conversation between Lovato and Alok was the sort of motivation or reasoning beneath the surface. Like, why might one identify as non-binary? What's the reason, or what's the grounds? And so I thought we could start with the reason or the grounds really quick, because what one hears in that podcast is an appeal to authenticity and embracing one's own truth, living one's life in an authentic way. And so, like, here's just one quotation. Lovato says, "We will discuss identity at large." I think that's the question of what it means to be non-binary, but also take the time to personally reflect on how I came into my truth, so that we, like many others, are able to live our lives authentically. So I was struck by that talk of authenticity, because I think that's a really common category that people these days are using to evaluate their lives. Am I living authentically? Is a question that people often ask themselves. I think this is one of the cardinal virtues of our contemporary culture, one of the few virtues we have left, but it's very much thought to be a virtue. And what's interesting is in this conversation that they had, the sort of vibe one gets it's sort of a quasi-religious vibe or a sort of therapeutic vibe, like embracing one's gender identity is part of like a flourishing human life, or a whole and healed human life.
Spiritual.
So for example, yeah, there's sort of like a spiritual vibe to it. So for example, at around the 5-minute mark, Demi Lovato says, after explaining the move to identifying as non-binary, "That's my truth. It's so much more important to live your truth rather than suppress yourself."
Mm-hmm.
And Lovato asked Alok early in the journey to this new identification, "Is being non-binary how you are healed?" And healed, it seems, from living one's life for other people's expectations, responding to other people's sort of judgments and opinions. And then here's the quote, the last quote I'll share for now that I really want to focus on. Around the 6-minute mark, Alok says, "Shame is joy interrupted." So Alok shares a history of sort of feeling ashamed at gender norms that are being imposed on everybody. And Alok struggled with that and felt a lot of shame, and has come to realize shame is joy interrupted. And Lovato responds very positively to that as sort of a bit of deep wisdom. And so the idea seems to be that, again, embracing one's gender identity, or identifying correctly and sort of announcing that and living in line with that, is an important way of sort of throwing off other people's expectations, not being oppressed by sort of society's rules or opinions about how you should live. And then that's kind of the recipe for a full and flourishing human life, is kind of living in the way that you want to live, living in a way that's true to oneself, living in a way without any shame. So just one thing I'll mention really quick is, at least for me, that sounded like it's in tension with something that I believe, which is that I'm not so sure that shame is necessarily bad. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but sometimes I think shame can be healthy, can be like a red light or a warning sign that you're doing something wrong. It can be good, it can be accurate, and I don't think that we should necessarily call what it interrupts joy. So, I mean, just suppose, for example, you're doing something really wicked or dirty or unhealthy, and let's just keep this G-rated. And so we could just use the example of, like, you're nearing the bottom of another Pringles can or something. You're really into Pringles and you just keep eating Pringles potato chips and you can't stop. So suppose you're nearing the bottom, and then you have that flash of realization, or your willpower kind of kicks back in, and you feel what people call shame. So in this case, I think what's happening is you're sort of realizing your gluttony, and you feel shame as a result. You sort of feel disappointed in yourself. And I think that can be okay. It can even be good. Even if you were enjoying the Pringles. So what was happening was your appetites and your urges were being satisfied as you ate those Pringles. But to say that that was joy that your shame interrupted, I think would be to indicate a really shallow conception of joy. To call that joy would be to indicate you have a really shallow conception of joy. There's more to
Yeah.
life, I would suggest, than just satisfying your urges. And so that was one thing I disagreed with when I watched the video.
Yeah, I think
Really,
if you
go
to
ahead.
use those really general terms and like shame is joy interrupted. Yeah, I think that idea is completely false if you think about it just generally. Like, it does that apply in every situation? And then you gave a counterexample.
Yeah.
Well, here's one example where that doesn't really apply. And I think that's right. You should feel, in some cases, you should feel shame for something bad that you've done. But maybe what they were trying to convey is that you shouldn't feel, or like when you're joyful about something that's like intrinsically or inherently good, like it's a good thing, but society say makes it seem like it's not a good thing and it's a bad thing, but in reality it's still a good thing. Then in that case,
Yeah.
the shame that you're feeling is, that's wrong, because that thing is underneath it that you were engaging in or you were doing was actually good underneath the surface. So I think maybe what they're saying is that, shame about something that's good is joy interrupted. And obviously
Yeah.
you've got to assume that there's some kind of joy here that's happening. Someone is experiencing some kind of joy in this thing that they're engaging in. But I think that might
Yeah. So
be,
I should say that I mean to kind of like set aside the gender conversation for a second. And I really just wanted to think about this conception of the virtues or conception of life according to which what we should be aiming for is an authentic life, where
mhm.
authenticity means something like doing what you most desire or doing what you most want. So although people often give voice to this as though it's a virtue and say that's what they want an authentic life. I think, as you point out, it just takes a little bit of reflection to realize that nobody really thinks that's what life is all about, just doing what you want, because obviously there are examples of things you might want that you shouldn't want. There are desires you might have that are kind of like disordered desires for things that are unhealthy or unproductive or harmful and so on. So really, I just wanted to address that sort of
Mhm.
conception of the good life that I heard beneath the surface of this conversation, according to which, again, the purpose of life is to be authentic or to follow your passion or follow your heart. And again, I think just a moment's reflection reveals that there's a big caveat there. You should follow your heart, follow your passion, follow your desires, only if they're good. And I think we can all agree that some
Yeah.
things are bad. But again, this is all independent of the gender conversation. I was just addressing that conception of life according to which authenticity is a virtue.
So I think that there's some other kind of confusions that happened for me when I was listening to Demi Lovato, or yeah, not necessarily like, sh- mainly because the way that I've kind of like grown up and learned some of these terms that are being used in the, so when someone says gender expression, maybe let's just get into it. That's a better way of moving forward. Gender expression, from what I understand, is about like your outward appearance and like the way that you say look, if it's masculine or
Yeah.
feminine. But when you say binary or non-binary, that to me seems like you're talking about your gender identity, maybe. So
Mhm.
some of the terms here are kind of confusing. Why don't we just run through like a list of some of the terms that were used? What does binary mean? Non-binary, gender expression, gender identity. She also used the term fluidity. So let's just
Mhm.
maybe unpack some of these terms and how they're used,
Yeah.
and that may also help provide some clarity here.
Yeah. Yeah. So something you said earlier in our conversation was this issue seems to you very confused, or it's confusing anyway. And I think that's right. The way I would put it is a lot of these terms that are used are rarely defined. And when they are defined, you hear many different incompatible definitions. But I think gender expression is one of the clearer ones. That one's
Hmm.
fairly easy to grasp. That just means something like how you behave and dress and present yourself, how you speak, um, and whether the ways in which you dress and present yourself and speak are stereotypically masculine or feminine. So to have like a masculine gender expression is to dress and speak and behave and walk and sit, even like how you stand and how you sit. There are sort of stereotypically masculine ways to do that, stereotypically
So
feminine
like a
ways to do that.
tomboy.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you might say, well, it's possible, certainly for a female or a woman to have a kind of masculine gender expression. And it's possible for a man or a male to have a kind of feminine gender expression. And then, of course, it's possible to kind of blend these expressions and have manners of speech and dress and presentation that don't really fit neatly into either category. And so when it comes to gender expression, it's fairly easy to make sense of the idea that somebody is neither masculine nor feminine. They're kind of like a blend. So that's clear enough. But something that one hears in this podcast is the claim that gender expression is what's outside, but gender identity is like what's inside, and that's what's real. And typically, in these conversations and among philosophers who work in this area, um, man is taken to be a gender term, a gender category. Woman is taken to be a gender category. And then it's said that non-binary is another gender category. It's sort of or I should just say this, it's neither man nor woman. It's sort of a third option when it comes to gender categorization. Can I just ask if you're still there, Cameron? Because I don't see your video anymore. Okay, you're still
Yeah,
there.
I'm still here. What
All
I
right.
do every now and then is I'll make you full screen, my guest full screen.
All right.
If
I
I need
just
to
thought
pick
I
my
lost
nose or something.
connection again. All right. And so, although gender expression is a fairly clear category, these other two terms I think are much less clear. One is gender, and one is gender identity. Um, so, gender means different things to different people. Sometimes it just means something like gender expression, like are you behaving in a kind of masculine way or a feminine way? Or it might refer to what sort of role you occupy in society. Are you being privileged because you're thought to be male? Are you being oppressed because you're thought to be female? Some people call these sort of gender roles, social positions that one holds.
Hmm.
Um, but other times, people think that a correct answer to the question, what is your gender, is given in terms like man or woman. And so the categories aren't like masculine and feminine, but rather man and woman. And then the claim that like gender is distinct from sex becomes really philosophically interesting because then the claim is like to be a man is not just a matter of your biology. To be a woman is not just a matter of your biology. It's something else. It's something like what role you occupy in society or how you present and how you express yourself, but it's not just biological. And with regard to gender identity, there, like, I think everybody should admit that that is a concept that needs a lot of philosophical attention. And philosophers working in this area are pretty clear on that. And in fact, one of the major motivations for working in this area is to try to get clear on what people might mean by that. What is gender identity? You like when asked what is your gender identity, people give answers like man, woman, or sometimes they'll use terms that are typically reserved for biological sex, female, male, or sometimes you'll get answers like non-binary, or I mean, there's a lot of other options that one finds. But when you ask like, what is it that unifies all these categories, man, woman, non-binary, gender fluid, and so on, what are all these, what is the genus that all of these are species of? It's really hard to say. And in this podcast conversation, the closest we get to a definition of non-binary, here, let me find it. So on this question of what does it mean to be non-binary, what is it to have a non-binary gender identity? At the 6-minute, 27-second mark around there, the guest, Alok, says, we are people who have existed for thousands of years, who actually experience ourselves outside the idea of man or woman. So it sounds like we're getting close to a definition, and it's something like to be non-binary is to experience oneself outside the idea of man or woman.
So it sounds like we're sort of transcending these terms.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. The idea is the reason it's called non-binary is, I think the way philosophers working in this area would explain it is Gender categories are often, commonly, typically taken to be binary. There are only two options. You're a man or you're a woman. But many people working in this area would say that is a mistake, and one needn't be in either one of these categories. And if you are in neither of these categories, then the sort of umbrella term is non-binary. But unfortunately, to be non-binary is to experience oneself as outside the ideas of man or woman. It's not super clear what that means, partly because of that spatial metaphor. Like, what is it to experience oneself outside an idea? So we get the spatial metaphor combined with idea. I mean, sometimes I experience myself as a philosopher, I guess. Like if I introspect and ask, like, who am I? What do I do? I guess like one possible answer is, well, I'm a philosopher. That's something I do for a living. Is that outside the idea of man or woman? Well, it is independent of the ideas of man or woman. It's not like if you're a philosopher, you got to be a man, or if you're a man, you got to be a philosopher, and same thing with women. So in that way, it's kind of independent of these gender concepts, but surely just experiencing myself as a philosopher isn't enough to make me non-binary. So one wants a little more out of a definition of non-binary. And I think maybe, let me just try to be maximally charitable here. So drawing on like conversations I've had and work I've done in this area, I think maybe what A. Locke meant was something like, well, when I think about whether I'm a man or a woman, when I introspect and sort of ask myself that question, my belief is that I'm not, or at least my desire is that I not be treated as a man or a woman. When I introspect and ask myself those questions, am I a man or am I a woman? The answer I get back is no, neither. Or maybe a better way to understand it is the question that I ask myself when I introspect is something like, what am I about really? Am I really a man? Am I really a woman? And if the answer comes back no, neither, then I guess that's the grounds for identifying as non-binary. And a philosopher working in this area, a trans philosopher, Talia May Betcher, calls this existential self-identity, contrasted with metaphysical self-identity. So the metaphysical self-identity concerns questions of like, what am I actually, like biologically, what am I? But existential self-identity is a question of like, what am I for? What am I about? What sort of commitments do I have? So for example, Betcher gives the example of identifying as a teacher. Even if you've never taught anything, like maybe you are committed to the idea of being a teacher, that's what you identify as, that's what you think like your purpose in life is to do, is to be a teacher. So that's like your existential self-identity. You're about teaching, you're for teaching. And so this is sort of aspirational or expressing a deep commitment. And in just the same way, Betcher says you can have a kind of existential self-identity as a woman, regardless of what's going on with your body or your gender expression. And maybe your existential self-identity is as a man, regardless of what's going on biologically. Or maybe your existential self-identity, as we see with Lovato and Alok, is neither man nor woman. And this has nothing to do with what's going on biologically. So I think that might be what's going on here. And if so, that would kind of harmonize with something another philosopher has said, Robin Dembrov, who is a non-binary philosopher at Yale University. So Dembrov defines non-binary like this. Dembrov says, I consider non-binary identity to be an unabashedly political identity. It is for anyone who wishes to wield self-understanding in service of dismantling a mandatory, self-reproducing gender system that strictly controls what we can do and be. So I think so Dembrov says it's an unabashedly political identity. So if you've got a certain kind of alignment or aspiration or goal or purpose, then this non-binary identity is for you. So just as being for certain policy positions can make you a libertarian or a communist or 100 other political identities, being for the abolition of gender norms is enough to warrant identifying as non-binary, it seems to me. And so again, it's like, has nothing to do with biology. It's a kind of alignment or aspiration or intention to abolish gender norms. I think that's what it means.
Yeah, and this is why things are so complicated. I should also mention that we've done another interview on gender, and it's really, really interesting. I highly recommend that you guys go check it out. I'll have it linked in the description later on. I don't have it linked right now for those watching live. But if you want to get a little bit clearer, here's some more different definitions of some of these terms, especially gender. Definitely go check out that interview. Really, really cool stuff. Okay, what other terms or do you have any other sort of overall thoughts or big things that you wanted to make sure that we touched on? I do kind of want to open it up to some Q&A. It seems like the live chat is going crazy, so I think it would be good to open it up to some Q&A. So if you guys are watching right now, you've got some questions for Dr. Bogardus related to anything about this, then please leave it in the live chat. You don't have to send it as a super chat, although that is a way to help support me and the ministry of my family. So if you'd like to do it that way, please feel free to do so, and thank you in return. So yeah, what are some other major things that you think are worth discussing?
There's at least one more thing that I think I should say. I want to say one thing about how a sort of mistake people make when they have conversations in this area, and it results in people kind of talking past each other. And then I had some thoughts about pronoun use and like how one ought to use pronouns, because Alok in this podcast kind of addresses an argument having to do with like how we ought to use pronouns. But maybe we could save that and see if anybody wants to bring that up from the chat. But one thing that I think I should say about the way conversations in this area sometimes devolve is this. So I think that some people, perhaps coming from a traditional religious background or just sort of having traditional views about biological sex and gender, when they hear claims, when they hear, like, for example, Demi Lovato and Alok saying things like, I am neither a man nor a woman, I am non-binary, I think what's being heard and what's being expressed are two different things. So I think what's often being heard is, if somebody says, I am neither a man nor a woman, what you might hear them saying, I am neither male nor female. And that's a claim about biology. And then, of course, people take issue with that. I think that's your phone, bro.
Yep, that was my phone. I've actually got a phone call scheduled right now that I completely forgot about. I'll get to it after the stream.
All right. And so what's being heard is a claim about biology, and naturally people take issue with that. But I think to save yourself some time and wasted time down needless tangents, again, I think what's being said is something different. When somebody says, or for example, when a trans woman says, I identify as a woman, or when a trans man says, I identify as a man, or when a non-binary person says, I am neither a man nor a woman, I think it's important to ask yourself, like, how are they using those words man and woman? What do they mean to express by that? Because obviously, if they're using them in the way that the dictionary defines those words, then they're making a claim at odds with biology. And so that would be, I think, a really uncharitable interpretation, and one that's going to cause more heat than light in the conversation. Rather, what I would encourage your viewers to do in these sorts of conversations is when people start making these identity claims or discussing these identity claims, think about it rather in the way that, again, Talia May Betcher put it, that philosopher put it. These are claims about existential self-identity. So Talia May Betcher interprets these sorts of claims in these trans, inclusive, and queer communities, claims about identification when one identifies as a man or a woman or neither. According to Talia May Betcher, trans philosopher, these claims are about how one wants to be treated. These are claims about how one wants to live or how one wants to be treated. They're not what Betcher calls metaphysical self-identity claims. They're existential self-identity claims. And so I think that can be a little shortcut to a more productive conversation, because often people end up talking past each other. One person hears the other as making a kind of metaphysical self-identity claim. Shouldn't even say metaphysical, just a biological self-identity claim. Whereas the person making the claim is saying something else, um, something about what they're for or what they're about or how they wish to be treated. So I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Here's one thing I want to get your thoughts on as questions keep rolling in. We've got a few different things to talk about from the live chat. One of the things that got me so interested in this lately is I spoke at a conference on Saturday, the Fearless Apologetics Conference, alongside Nancy Piercy, and she talked about transgenderism. She had some really interesting things to say that have just been sort of sitting in my mind, and I've been thinking about it a lot. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. In talking about transgenderism, she had a bunch of quotes from leftists and people who are, I guess, on that side of things ideologically and everything. So one of the things that she was pointing out is that there's this overemphasis of the mind over the body, and the body basically can't tell you anything. So the mind is in control. The mind makes up all of the categories. You can identify however you'd like, because it's the mind ultimately that sort of matters and has value and can speak, and is also the primary motivating factor behind identity, like who you are. It's all about the mind, which I just found really interesting. And then the other side of it is that the body can't tell you anything. The body is sort of a passenger, and you're in the driver's seat as, that you're the mind. And so what she argues, and what a lot of conservatives like herself argue, is that the body actually can tell you something. And so unless you sort of take that perspective, that it's not just your mind is important, but it's all the body can tell you something, and then you've got to find a sort of cohesive way to make the two make sense. And that's really how you're going to get your identity, is by listening to what both tell you, not just what one tells you. So what are your views on that? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting, and thanks for bringing it up. My reaction, just sort of off the cuff, is I want to add a little addendum to what I just said, because what I just said makes it sound like these disputes are merely verbal, but I don't think that's right. It's not that people are just talking past each other, and if they only started using the same terms, they'd agree. I don't think that's quite right, because there is a view in this area that I think is kind of rising to prominence. It's certainly very well represented, according to which biological sex categories, like male and female, the way those words are traditionally used and used by biologists, those categories aren't real. They are imposed by us on nature, but nature itself doesn't really answer to these categories. We're imposing these categories on nature, but there really is no such thing in nature. It would be like another culture, maybe a primitive culture, that had the concept of witches or something like that, and applied this concept to people and said, that's a witch, that's not a witch. And they're kind of separating people into the witch and non-witch category. But these categories aren't real. There are no witches. Some people are pretty clear that they think the same thing goes with biological sex categories. We speak and think as if there are males and there are females, and maybe some intersex categories as well. But really, we made these categories up. It was arbitrary, and we should revise the boundaries, or maybe stop using the categories altogether. But I think more commonly people think we should revise the concepts. Mm-hmm. And instead of thinking that male is tracking something biological and the word female is tracking something biological, we should use these terms to track something psychological, gender identity, and again, how one wishes to be treated, or how one wishes to live, or what one is about at a deep level. That's what we should reserve these words for. And there, I think this is not merely a verbal dispute. This would have really serious consequences. And there are really serious policy questions to be determined here. And that's what explains a lot of the conflict that one finds on Twitter, in the literature, in conversation, when it comes to sex segregated spaces. So what, for example, the gender critical feminists are concerned about is losing the ability to segregate spaces on the basis of biological sex. If we adopt this view on which biological sex isn't real and it's not the sort of thing we should track, instead we should just be tracking gender identity with our terms male and female, man and woman, then we will lose the ability to have sex segregated bathrooms, women's shelters, sports teams, prisons, and so on. And so you've probably encountered those sorts of issues if you observe these conversations on Twitter and elsewhere. And I think this is what explains why those conversations are arising.
Well, let's get to some I was about to say Q&A and questions at the same time. Here's a question from Maverick Christian. Thanks for your super chat, Wade. He says, what exactly is gender? We'll start at the basics.
What exactly is gender?
You've kind of commented on some of the ways that different people view it. So you could just, at this point, give your own view or your own proposal, but
I'll say
it
this.
however you like.
So I will say that if you rewind like 100 years, what you'll find is people use the word gender just in conversations about grammar and linguistics. It was a grammatical term, and it had to do with a feature of many languages according to which nouns typically come in at least two varieties, sometimes more, depending on the language. Like German has 3 genders. Nobody really thinks that these languages are actually tracking anything that has much to do with biological sex. There are all sorts of weird exceptions. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but like in German, I don't know. But in German, like the noun tree might be feminine, but gosh, I don't know. But like orchard or something might be masculine. Things like that happen. And so it doesn't really look like it has much to do with biological sex, but sometimes it does. Like usually in these languages, man is masculine, husband is masculine, and so on. And so we called some of these nouns feminine, some of these nouns masculine. And this feature of the language, the genus of these two things was called gender. It was the gender of the noun. Okay, so that's where the term came from. And then what happened is in the early and mid 1900s, psychologists, philosophers, and psychiatrists who started thinking about and studying the ways males and females are expected to behave in society and how people respond to that. Sometimes they're sort of traumatized or punished or medicalized based on their behavior. Psychologists, philosophers, and psychiatrists started studying what they were pretty clear was masculinity and femininity, like stereotypical ways that males are supposed to behave, stereotypical ways that females are supposed to behave, and the kind of psychological consequences of those norms. Okay, and just as a matter of fact, although we already had words like feminine and masculine, we didn't have a nice genus word. Like, what are these two things examples of? What are these kinds of? So like man and woman are both kinds of human. Masculine and feminine are both kinds of what? And so what happened is psychologists and philosophers and psychiatrists borrowed the word gender from linguistics and said, we'll call masculinity and femininity examples of gender. And so originally, again, if you rewind about 100 years, you'll find that the word gender just referred to masculinity and femininity. And those are just stereotypical ways that males and females are expected to behave. And this might vary from society to society. And that's why we called the norms about how males and females ought to behave gender norms. Okay, but then something that started happening, I think, with especially with the publication of Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, in 1949, if I remember correctly. The famous quote that comes from that book that many people have heard is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Of course, this is in translation because the original was in the French, but that's the quote. "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And so starting from about that point, people started thinking that, the idea behind that quote seems to be, you are socialized into being a woman. You are taught how to be a woman. You're taught certain kinds of behaviors that are womanly. And only once you adopt that role are you properly considered a woman. That's how many people interpret that quote. I think that's a misinterpretation. But anyway, that's how many people interpret it. And so then people started using words like man and woman as gender terms, not masculine and feminine, but man and woman. And so the idea was like you're born with a certain kind of biology, but then you're socialized into being a man or a woman. And so now it's not just that being masculine is different from your biology or being feminine is different from your biology, but rather being a man is not determined by your biology and being a woman is not determined by your biology. And so for a long time, that was sort of the standard way these words were used. Male and female were reserved for biological sex. Man and woman were considered gender terms. And the prevailing assumption was there is a sex-gender distinction. Being a man is not defined in terms of your biology. It's not defined in terms of being male. Being a woman is not defined in terms of being female. So that's how things stood. I guess, I don't know until exactly when, maybe the 90s and the last, well, I guess I can't say the last decade anymore, first decade of the 21st century. But what we've seen in recent years, and this is the last thing I'll say about this is a long answer to the question. But what we've seen in recent years is a kind of recollapse of the sex-gender distinction. So the traditional view was to be a man is just to be an adult human female, to be a woman is to be an adult human, to be a man is to be an adult human male, to be a woman is to be an adult human female. And then we get a sex-gender distinction according to which being a man is something different from being an adult human male, same thing with women. But what's happened in the last, 20 years or so is a kind of recollapse of this distinction. And now a lot of people seem comfortable with the idea that being a man is being male, but guess what? Male has nothing to do with biology. Male is a gender identity. Male is determined by your psychology. And so that's just a very brief sort of recap of the history of this concept of gender. And so I guess maybe the short answer is, if you're asked, what does the word gender mean? You should say, gender is said in many ways. It is used in many different ways by many different people. And so maybe we should just specify what it means.
That's fair enough. But it was a good history lesson. I feel like I learned a lot in that. So here's another question from AJ Salmon. Thanks for your super chat, AJ. How does scripture inform your view on gender identity?
Just typing this down. How does scripture inform my view of gender identity? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think many of your viewers are probably Protestants. And there was this Nashville statement a few years ago, which is kind of as close as Protestants get to like an ecumenical church council. And it seemed like the authors of the Nashville statement were trying to take a position on these gender issues and trying to kind of marshal scriptural support for their positions. And the position they wanted to take, it seems, is just the kind of like traditional dictionary view, according to which being a man is just being an adult human male. Maybe you're masculine, maybe you're not. If you're a man, you're a male who's an adult and a human. And same thing with woman, adult human female. And the Nashville statement said something like, humans are sort of designed or intended to have a self-conception that's consistent with their biology. And so I think that was the Nashville statement's way of trying to say, you should not identify as a woman if you're not female, and similarly for man. So I'll just say this, the sort of scripture that was offered by the authors of the Nashville statement, I think is underdeterminative. It doesn't prove the views that they're putting forward. And I don't think that's the fault of the authors of the Nashville statement or the fault of scripture. I think that just this kind of conceptual reshuffling that we're observing in our contemporary culture was not foreseen by the authors of scripture and not addressed by the authors of scripture. I mean, scripture says stuff like God created humans male and female. But I mean, that's something that even somebody who's on board with contemporary gender ideology could affirm and say, yeah, there are males and females. There are other people as well, and these categories are determined by your psychology. I think that's a pretty strained reading of scripture. But all that to say, like there's no book in the Bible that addresses contemporary gender ideology on its own terms and clearly rejects it or something like that. But that's all right. If you're wondering, like, is there a kind of view when it comes to gender that fits best with a Christian view of the world or is most congruent with a Christian view of the world? There, I think the answer is yes. I mean, the authors of the Bible seem to have a conception of human beings that seems to be in tension with the kind of contemporary gender ideology that we're seeing emerge. I just mean to say that I don't think you're going to be able to like proof text your way in a straightforward manner to any sort of view. It's going to be a more kind of comprehensive, systematic case that one must make. So that's my reaction to that question.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so we've got a question from Kit Alcock, and this one is a really good one. He says, question, is Betcher's view, are trans women, on Betcher's view, are trans women literally women? By not construing trans identity claims as not metaphysical, she seems to suggest that trans women aren't really women. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think what Kit was responding to there was the bit of Betcher where I shared some stuff about existential self-identity. And it seems like Betcher's suggestion, I believe this is in a 2009 paper, Trans Identities and First-Person Authority. If you want to just Google that, I'm pretty sure you can find it for free. Trans Identities and First-Person Authority, where Betcher is talking about subaltern contexts and how these gender terms are used in those contexts. Betcher suggests and seems to pretty clearly say that what's being expressed by use of these gender terms is how one wishes to be treated. Now, if you asked Betcher, well, strictly speaking, literally, are trans women women? Well, I think Betcher's project is to do a bit of, or to advocate for a kind of linguistic, I don't want to say revolution, but revision, a kind of linguistic revision, according to which, and Betcher's pretty clear about this, we no longer use terms like man and woman to disclose genital status. That's how Betcher puts it. Betcher says this is a kind of invasion of privacy to like use gender terms and pronouns to communicate genital status. It's bordering on, I don't want to misattribute anything, but it's something, it's not quite assault, but it's pretty aggressive to like demand that people disclose their genital status. And why are we circulating this information anyway? And so what Betcher advocates for is revising our use of the words man and woman and male and female to no longer communicate anything about biology, but rather to communicate this kind of existential self-identity. So again, if you ask Betcher literally, are trans women women? I think what Betcher would say is, well, here's how we ought to use the words, such that the answer is yes. But if you ask the question about biology, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what Betcher's views are about biological sex. But I will say one can kind of observe an evolution in the conception of trans identities from like the 80s until now. I mean, once upon a time, the reason the prefix trans was chosen was because the thought was there's a kind of gender spectrum and a biological sex spectrum. And you can be on both sides of the spectrum, in which case you're cis, you can be masculine and male. So you're cisgender. You can be feminine and a female, cisgender, or you can be on opposite ends of these spectrums. You can be very masculine and yet female, or very feminine and yet male, in which case you're transgender. And this conception of transgender requires that biological sex be real. It's sort of built into the definition. But as I said, it seems like the continual evolution of these words is such that now a lot of people seem to deny that biological sex is real. And so these terms male and female are kind of up for grabs, and what they should express is something purely psychological. So I just don't know where Betcher stands on that question. Maybe there's some text that would shed light on this, but none comes to mind at the moment.
Fair enough. Okay, let's get to one last question, then we'll close it out. And this one is related to something I talked about earlier and you commented on. Louise Ama says, if the mind is in control, can we choose our race, skin color, ethnicity too?
Yeah, that's a common question that people bring up. And there's actually, I'm tempted to Google it right now, but there's a real life example, and I think the story was in
Oh,
Vice, of a person who identifies as, oh, so this person was, let's put this in non-tendentious sort of neutral terms. This person was identified as male at birth, um, has XY chromosomes, looks like the body's organized around the production of sperm and so on, biologically male, identifies as a woman, and yet also identifies, even though this person is of European ancestry, identifies as Filipino. Um, and this person has adopted a sort of Filipino name. And what was interesting about this Vice article is the gender claims were taken for granted. In this article, this person was uniformly referred to as a woman, and using feminine pronouns and so on. But what was held up for a kind of mockery, even in this article, was this, as the article put it, this white person is claiming to be Filipino. And so, like, the racial claim was not taken seriously at all. And there are other examples as well. I mean, we've got the Rachel Dolezal example. And there are other examples more recently. One seems to come out every month of people kind of passing or living as races or ethnicities that they're not really.
I saw
It's,
I saw one
yeah, go
article
ahead.
of a guy who identified as 6 years old or something like that.
Okay,
Was
yeah, that's
reading
another
about
thing.
that.
So I think this is evidence I've spent too much time on Twitter, I think, but I think there's a community, and I believe they call themselves the Littles, I think, and they identify as like children or even babies, even though they were born 40 years ago or whatever. And I mean, there are other examples of people who have a kind of what you might consider an existential self-identity when it comes to like other species, other ages, other races and ethnicities, and so on. So yeah, I think a valid question is, why are we treating these cases differently? And so one thing I'll just quickly refer you to is, if you Google Robin Dembrov, that's that philosopher I mentioned earlier, why we shouldn't compare transracial to transgender identity. That's the title of the article. You'll find one attempt to explain why these cases are treated differently. Um, but for myself, I think that the answer is really something more like, I think the answer is this. I think people working in the philosophy of gender who are sort of trans inclusive, trans activists, they typically acknowledge that the way gender terms were traditionally used rules out trans women from being women and trans men from being men, and non-binary people really are men or really are women, one or the other. So they acknowledge that that's the way the words were traditionally used. They acknowledge that traditionally gender terms were tied to biological sex. But they think we should change this. And if you ask them why we should change it, they will cite social justice reasons, like in order to prevent the oppression and
By
assault,
depression.
violence, and so on, because trans people are oppressed, and there are a lot of them. And one way to mitigate this oppression is this kind of linguistic revision. Okay, so they're pretty clear that that's the reason. And so if you ask them, well, what about these other cases? I think the honest answer is like, well, there hasn't been enough political will. It's sort of like asking, I don't know, maybe there are other examples of like, if you ask an environmentalist, well, you care so much about the whales. Why don't you care about gray wolves or something like that? Or maybe there's some issue that environmentalists have kind of not had on their radar or not devoted a lot of attention to. I think the only answer is my principles might commit me to that, but there's a finite amount of energy and political will, and so we're prioritizing causes. And so I think if trans racialism started having the same kind of profile as transgender issues. If there were a lot of people and they were being severely oppressed and so on, then you might see this kind of linguistic revision applied to the race, our racial concepts as well. But just as a matter of fact, as things have gone so far, there's been a lack of political will or energy or time or attention. I think that's the answer. And I'm not presenting that as like a criticism or anything. I think that once you understand the sort of grounds or basis or reason for this linguistic revision, you'll see, well, that's why it's happened in some cases and not others.
So we did have one super chat that came in from Cy Gart, who's going to be speaking at our conference we've got coming up, Capturing Christianity V1. It's our first conference, and he'll be speaking. He's an not an ex-biochemist, he's an ex-atheist. He was a biochemist, got a PhD and everything, and he became a Christian through the science. And he's got an amazing story. So go check out his book that he's written. I've even done an interview with him, and he'll be in person talking at our conference. But he sends in this question for you. Is it only humans who are considered to say sex is not real? Does it apply to other primates, other animals?
Yeah, so the way I'm interpreting this question is regarding those people who are kind of skeptics about the reality of biological sex, are they skeptics not only of biological sex when it comes to humans, but also other species? And I think the answer is yes. I think they say, like, across the board, this is kind of it's a human construct. We invented this concept of biological sex, and we are superimposing it on reality. Reality itself doesn't contain biological sexes. Let me just say one thing really quick. I know we're short on time, but let me try to motivate this view and maybe scare you a little bit with how plausible it might be. If I ask you how many continents there are, the answer is everybody knows. Everybody knows there's 7 continents. But when you start trying to define continent, you'll find that the boundaries are really fuzzy and kind of arbitrary. Like, why is Australia a continent and not just a really big island? How is Africa a different continent from Europe and Asia? They're connected. I mean, there's a little canal, but sometimes it gets clogged with ships, and the canal wasn't always there. Or how about North and South America? We're told those are 2 different continents, but they're connected. And so once you start reflecting on this concept of continent, you might think to yourself, well, humans just kind of made up the answer that there's 7. There could have just been like 3 or 4 or maybe more, but we settled on 7. It was kind of arbitrary. Reality itself doesn't contain continents. We brought that to the study of the earth and so on. But we didn't find it in nature. We didn't discover it, we invented it. Okay, the thought is the same thing goes with biological sex. Once you start trying to like define what biological sex is, you'll find a lot of like borderline cases and fuzzy cases, some intersex conditions where it's not clear whether the person's male or female. And so the same sort of considerations that might lead you to believe this concept of continent was made up might lead you to believe that the concept of biological sex was kind of made up and superimposed on reality and not actually there. And this is the very last thing I'll say, just as a quick pushback, because I don't want to leave your viewers thinking that that's the way things are. At least sometimes that's not the way it works. Sometimes we really do genuinely discover categories and don't invent them. And the existence of borderline cases or fuzzy cases or vague cases doesn't preclude the possibility that the categories are real. Just consider the categories alive and dead, or alive and not alive. There are borderline cases. Like every time something dies, there's always a period where you're like not sure whether it's dead or not. And it seems kind of arbitrary to draw a line and say that's where death occurred. But does anybody want to actually say with a straight face that there's actually no such thing as life and death? This is all just made up by humans. I don't think so. So categories can be real and we can discover them in nature, even if there are sort of borderline cases. So the fact that there are kind of borderline cases between the 2 sexes, I think doesn't foreclose the possibility that those categories are real.
Well, Dr. Bogardus, thank you for coming on. I think that's going to do it for us today. We didn't want to go super long today. Again, this was Demi put out her video today, and I saw it. I thought it was sort of interesting and worth commenting on. So let me know what you think in the comments of this video. Dr. Bogardus, again, thanks for coming on. I'm sure that we'll do some more work together soon. But until next time, we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video, which we actually have another one tomorrow. If you're watching this live, we've got a Q&A on abortion with Stephanie Gray and Callum Miller. So that one should be really cool. Anyways, we'll see you guys soon. See you later.